Most people's confidence is not their own. They didn't build it. They inherited it. Someone told them they were capable before they had a single piece of evidence. A parent, a teacher, a mentor, someone whose opinion carried weight looked at them early and said, "You have what it takes." And that sentence, repeated in different forms across years, became the foundation they stand on today. They call it self-belief. Jung would call it something more precise and considerably more unsettling. Now consider the person who never received that sentence. Same intelligence, same drive, same hours put in, different starting line. That person isn't just disadvantaged in the obvious ways, the missing connections, the closed doors, the absence of someone to open them. They are facing something the supported person will likely never have to confront in their entire life. A question so fundamental that most people are protected from it by the scaffolding around them. Who are you, when no one has ever told you? I'm David. Welcome to our channel. Let's take this journey together. Here is what almost nobody says plainly, because it is uncomfortable, and because comfort is what most people come to this topic for. The person with the mentor, the supportive family, the network that opens doors before you even know to knock on them. They are moving faster than you. That is not a myth you need to deconstruct to feel better about your situation. It is real. Resources compress timelines. Belief, injected early by people whose opinion you trusted, moves differently through a life than belief you had to locate yourself in silence. If you have watched this happening in real time, watched someone with half your capability move twice as far because of who they know and who believed in them first, you have not been imagining it. This is the part where most conversations about disadvantage pivot to reassurance. Something about how your struggle is building character, how the difficulty is secretly a gift, how one day you'll look back and understand why it had to be this way. That is not what this is. Reassurance in this territory is just another form of not taking your situation seriously, and you deserve to have your situation taken seriously. But here is what rarely gets examined with the same honesty. What support accelerates, it also shapes, and the shape it produces carries a structural vulnerability that only becomes visible under one specific condition, the condition of the support being removed. Jung spent his career mapping the architecture of the self, and what he found consistently was that the people most catastrophically destabilized by failure, rejection, and isolation were rarely those who had struggled from the beginning. They were the ones who had been well supported, and then weren't. The mentor who disappeared, the family structure that collapsed, the professional identity that dissolved overnight. When the scaffolding came down, what was revealed beneath it was often shockingly thin, not because the person was weak, but because the scaffolding had been doing work they didn't know was being done on their behalf. The confidence they carried wasn't theirs, it was borrowed, and borrowed things eventually get called back. This is not an argument that struggle is preferable to support. It is an argument that struggle, when understood, rather than merely endured, produces something that support structurally cannot. And understanding the difference between those two outcomes is the entire difference between a life that eventually finds its footing and one that simply exhausts itself trying. To understand what you have actually been building, without knowing you were building it, you need to understand how most people construct a sense of self in the first place. Jung was precise about this. The self that most people walk around with isn't something they built from the inside out. It is something they assembled, piece by piece, from the outside in. Parental approval that got internalized as worth. Institutional validation that got internalized as competence. The steady accumulation of other people's belief, absorbed so gradually and so seamlessly that it eventually began to feel like it was theirs all along. It functions like a self, It feels like a self, but its foundations run outward, not inward. And that distinction matters enormously when the ground shifts. Think about what it actually means to grow up with genuine support. It means someone told you that you were capable before you had evidence. It means a teacher pointed you toward a path and said, "You belong here." It means that when you doubted yourself at 2 a.m., there was a voice somewhere, a memory of someone who believed in you, that absorbed the silence before it got too loud. It means your worth was reflected back to you so consistently, from so many directions, that you eventually stopped needing the reflection. You assumed the worth directly. You call it confidence. And it is. But its roots are not where you think they are. The self that forms under those conditions is functional, often genuinely impressive. But it is, in a precise structural sense, contingent. It was built on conditions that exist outside the person carrying it, which means it is, at some level, dependent on those conditions continuing. Now remove them. What remains is the question most people are never asked. Who are you when the approval stops? Who are you when no institution is conferring legitimacy on your work? When no mentor is telling you the direction is right? When you fail, and there is simply silence? Not the temporary quiet between one form of validation and the next. The silence that just continues. Most people never find out. Not because they lack the capacity to answer, but because the scaffolding around them never fully collapses. There is always something to absorb the question before it lands too hard. A friend who talks them back from the edge. A family who steps in. A professional success that arrives just in time to restore the narrative. You don't have that buffer. The question has been landing, and what you have been doing with it, finding something in the silence that holds, however slowly, however incompletely, is the mechanism by which a different kind of self forms. One whose foundations run inward rather than outward. One that doesn't need the scaffolding because it was never built on it. In 1913, Carl Jung severed his relationship with Sigmund Freud. This was not a minor professional disagreement. Freud was, at that point, the most powerful validator in the psychoanalytic world. His endorsement had given Jung's work its legitimacy, its audience, its institutional weight. When the break came, Jung didn't just lose a colleague. He lost the structure that had been confirming his worth to the world. The psychoanalytic establishment turned its back. The frameworks that had housed his ideas dissolved. What remained was Jung alone with his thoughts, in a period he later described as one of the most disorienting and dangerous of his life. A confrontation with something close to disintegration, where the interior architecture he had built partly on borrowed approval was suddenly required to stand on its own. It didn't collapse, but what emerged from that period was not the same self that entered it. What Jung discovered in that solitude, about the psyche, about the nature of identity, about what a self actually consists of when external confirmation is entirely removed, became the foundation of everything he would later build, not despite the isolation, through it. He didn't emerge from that period weaker or more defended. He emerged as someone who knew, with a precision that no external validation could have produced, exactly who he was, because he had been forced to find out without anyone's help. That is not a motivational story. It is a structural observation. The process that felt like destruction was, in fact, construction of a different and more durable kind. And the same process, unglamorous, unwitnessed, without ceremony, is what the conditions of your life have been running on you. There are two traps that destroy most people walking this path. Understanding them is not optional, because you are almost certainly closer to one of them than you realize. The first is victimization, not in the crude sense, not self-pity performed for an audience, in the quiet, internal sense. The point at which the genuine injustice of your circumstances, and it is a genuine injustice, Jung would never ask you to pretend otherwise, becomes the total explanation for every failure and the justification for every retreat. Bitterness has the texture of clarity. It feels like realism. It feels like you are finally seeing the situation as it actually is, without the false comfort of pretending the playing field is level. And in one sense you are. The playing field is not level. That is true. But bitterness is a closed system. Nothing new can enter it, because everything that enters gets recruited as further evidence of the original wound. Every failure confirms the rigging. Every closed door confirms the disadvantage. Every person who moves faster confirms the injustice. And quietly, this is the part that costs the most. Your possibilities get conscripted into the same narrative. If the system is fully responsible for your failures, it is also, by the same logic, fully responsible for your outcomes. The agency goes with the blame. You don't notice this happening. It feels like clear-eyed honesty. It feels like you have finally stopped lying to yourself about how hard this is. But the clarity is selective. It sees the injustice with precision and stops seeing everything else. What it cannot see, what a closed system by definition cannot see, is what remains possible within the constraints. The door that is actually open. The direction that doesn't require the connection you don't have. The move that is available right now, if you are willing to look for it rather than catalogue what blocked the last one. Bitterness feels like it's directed outward. It is always also directed inward. At something it is closing. The second trap is its mirror image. Call it heroic isolation. The decision, made somewhere below conscious awareness, after being hurt enough times, that needing nothing and no one is not a wound, but a superpower. The person who has reached for support and been denied it enough times eventually stops reaching. This is understandable. Reaching and being refused is one of the more painful experiences available to a human being. The mind, which is above all else interested in not repeating pain, finds a solution. It reclassifies the need. What was once a genuine desire for connection and validation gets reframed as weakness. What was once a reasonable hope for support gets reframed as dependency. And slowly, the person who was hurt by the absence of others constructs a philosophy that makes the absence a choice. Independence becomes ideology. Solitude becomes armor. The person who once needed connection and was refused it now insists, with complete conviction, that they never needed it at all. Jung was precise about what this costs. After the break from Freud, he did not romanticize his isolation. He endured it consciously, while maintaining real anchors in the world, his family, his clinical work. Small but genuine connections that kept him tethered to human reality while the interior work proceeded. He understood that the goal was not to need nothing. The goal was to locate a center that didn't depend on everything. Those are not the same thing. One is liberation. The other is a more sophisticated form of the original wound. The person who builds the wall of heroic isolation doesn't become stronger. They become more defended. And defended is not the same as developed. Defended means the wall is doing the work the self should be doing. Developed means the self is strong enough that the wall is no longer necessary. What both traps share is this. They are unconscious responses to pain that bypass the actual work. Victimization bypasses it by making the external world fully responsible. Heroic isolation bypasses it by making the self fully sufficient. Both are fictions. Both feel from the inside like they are protecting something real. The path between them is narrow. It requires holding two things simultaneously that the mind desperately wants to collapse into one: the genuine injustice of your circumstances and the genuine agency you still possess within them, not one or the other, both in full tension without the relief of resolution. That tension is not a problem to be solved. It is the condition under which the real work happens. Here is what the real work actually produces. You made a decision in genuine uncertainty and lived with the consequences. Not the kind of uncertainty that comes with a safety net underneath it. The real kind, where if the decision was wrong, there was no one positioned to catch what fell. You failed without a net and didn't permanently stop. You doubted yourself in complete silence. No one to process it with. No one to tell you it was normal. No one to remind you of your own capability at the moment you most needed reminding. And found eventually something in the silence that held. Not because someone handed it to you, because you had no other option but to locate it yourself. That process, repeated, unglamorous, unwitnessed, without anyone marking it as significant or telling you it was building something. That is the mechanism by which an interior structure forms that no external force can dismantle. Because no external force built it. Jung described the fully developed personality as something that cannot be shaken by the withdrawal of approval, cannot be reoriented by the removal of institutional support, cannot be collapsed by the disappearance of the people who once confirmed its worth. Not because it is defended against those things, walls can be breached, but because it is not resting on any of them. It was forged in the place those things cannot reach, the interior, the silence, the long, unglamorous process of finding out who you are when no one is watching and no one is confirming, and the answer has to come from somewhere inside rather than somewhere outside. That is not an aspiration for you. It is a description of what your conditions have been constructing, whether you recognize the construction or not. This is the asymmetry that gets lost every time you compare your progress to someone else's. They are building faster. That is real, and it is unfair, and it is not a myth. But you are building differently. And differently, in this specific case, means building something that belongs entirely to you. A confidence that was tested before it was claimed, not handed over before it was earned. A sense of direction developed not as a preference, but as a requirement, because there was no one to point the way. A capacity for independent judgment that was forged through necessity, not chosen as a philosophy. The risk, and it is a real risk worth naming plainly, is that none of this matters if the building stops. If the pressure produces not a forged self, but a fractured one. If the solitude tips from necessary into something that closes rather than opens, that contracts rather than develops. The difference between those two outcomes is not talent. It is not luck. It is not even raw effort, because you have already demonstrated more than enough of that. It is consciousness, the willingness to understand what the process is actually doing to you, and to navigate it with intention rather than simply endure it and hope the endurance is enough. You have been enduring it. That kept you here. But endurance is not the destination. Endurance is what you do until you understand what you're enduring, and why, and what it is actually producing. That understanding is what turns a difficult path into an intentional one. And an intentional path, however hard, is a different thing entirely from a difficult one you are simply surviving. At some point, the question of whether you can win without support has to give way to a harder question. Not can you, but who are you becoming in the attempt? Because that is what this has always been about. Underneath the comparison, underneath the inventory of everything you were never given, underneath the exhaustion of moving through a world that hands certain people a head start and asks you to pretend it doesn't, underneath all of it, a self has been forming, quietly, without announcement, without anyone witnessing the construction or marking its progress. Jung's answer to that question is not comfortable, and it is not motivational. It is plain. The self that emerges from genuine necessity, from having to locate your own values without anyone confirming them, your own direction without anyone pointing it, your own worth without anyone reflecting it back, is the only self that is fully yours, not inherited, not borrowed, not contingent on conditions that can shift overnight. Yours, because you built it in the one place no external force can reach or remove. This is not a consolation prize. It is a structural fact about how identity actually forms under pressure versus how it forms under support. The support itself is real, but it has a hidden dependency, the continuation of the conditions that built it. The self forged in the absence of those conditions has no such dependency. It stands on its own because there was nothing else for it to stand on. Most people never find out who they are in that sense, not because they lack the capacity, not because they are weaker or less capable, but because they were never sufficiently stripped of the alternatives. The support held, the validation continued, the scaffolding never fully came down. They lived their whole lives inside a self that functioned perfectly well and belonged in ways they never had to examine, partly to everyone who had a hand in building it. They will never know how much of what they call their confidence is actually other people's belief wearing their name. You don't have that ambiguity. Everything that could be removed has been, or is being removed. And what remains, what you are discovering remains, in the silence, in the uncertainty, in the moments when the doubt lands and there is no one to push it back, is the only thing Jung ever considered worth the name of a self. Not the performance, not the accumulated approval, not the version assembled from other people's expectations of who you should be. The thing underneath, which was always there, which the pressure did not create, which it only revealed. That is not the end of something. It is not the consolation at the close of a difficult chapter. It is the beginning of the only kind of life that cannot be taken from you, because it was never given to you in the first place, because you found it yourself. In the one place it was always waiting, in the silence, when no one was watching, when no one was confirming, when the only voice available was your own, and you listened. If this names something you've been carrying, write it in the comments. One sentence. What it recognized in you. That is where it starts. Thanks for listening, and I hope you've gained something from our time together. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. This helps us to continue to keep making great content for you. Take care as always.